Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're hoping that you're all getting logged on all right, and we will start at 3:05, so that gives you about another 4 and a bit minutes to get settled. And then the format will be that Dilip will give his presentation, and we will allow a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A session. You can make your Q&As or your cues of the Q&As by using the Q&A button on your screen. Please do not use the chat button. The chat button won't work. You're muted out on the chat, but if you type in a question that you want Dilip to answer, we'll endeavour to get through as many as we can. And the idea being that we will have the webinar finished in time for about 10 minutes worth of questions. So we will get as many questions in as we can. So make yourself happy and get ready for our start. We will be starting in about 3 minutes. So I hope you're all settling down. Give you a 2-minute warning. So for those of you who've just joined us, the questions at the end, we'll be taking questions, or as many of them as we can in the time available. The questions will be those that are typed in using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We are fairly sure we will get some questions because we have a huge turnout today. If everybody who's booked turns up, and I hope they all will do, the count is 171 people joining us this afternoon, which is fantastic. We hope that you will enjoy it. I'm sure you will enjoy it. And so I'll leave you for the last minute to get settled down before we get going. Well, hopefully everybody's on board, all 171 of you, and formally welcome you to the webinar, which is going to be given this afternoon by Dilip Sarkar. I've known Dilip for many, many years, probably too many years that neither of us wish to put a count on. But Dilip, I first knew him when I was a schoolboy in Worcester, and he was a PC. That means police constable, not what it means today. And Dilip's actually applied his forensic training in the police to a lifelong interest in all things World War II. And he's become a prolific writer and author, concentrating on mainly the human element of World War II. He's enjoyed a close relationship with a few, as of one or two of us in the trust, over many, many years, and got to know quite a few of the relatives as well. And he has amassed a vast resource, a really vast resource of material on World War II, and in particular the Battle of Britain and the Few. And as a result, has become a well-recognised authority on the battle. He was made an MBE in 2003, sorry, for services to aviation history. So that shows the renown that he has, and he is also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dilip for his very, very interesting talk on Letters from the Few. So over to Dilip.
Thanks, Andy, and welcome to everybody. I have to say that it is a real privilege to be doing this afternoon to support the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust, which of course is responsible for the all-important National Memorial, and to remember old friends. Now, I was that schoolboy in the 1960s that grew up. We couldn't get away from World War II, could we? It was on the TV, there were the films, there were the Airfix models, Action Man, goodness knows what, you know. Well, I was absolutely up for all of this. And in 1969, of course, the Battle of Britain film came out, which inspired a whole new generation. And I think then I was 7 or 8 years old, and about the same time as that photograph there, which is the first time I ever actually at last got to see a Spitfire, which was at Little Rissington Air Show. But as I got older, the thing that really deeply moved and motivated me was the stories of casualties. And it was that research that brought me into contact with survivors. And it was an astonishing time, because back then, and we're talking about the late 70s and early 1980s, the survivors were among us, and the emphasis was very much on the famous pilots who'd either written their own and published their own memoirs, or books had been written about them. And it was strange, really, because so many of these fantastic people were living in anonymity, with a shoebox up in the attic with logbooks and medals and photographs, and it was that fascinated me, and I resolved to record these memories, really at a time when there was very little interest in it, I have to say, without resources or support, really. It was very much a sort of schoolboy's passion. And it developed over time into, as Andy says, you know, a very, very serious study and a lifetime's work. And the great thing was that these people, in spite of our difference in age, they became my friends. And it was extraordinary privilege to be able to talk about them in this deep and personal way. Now, interestingly, although I was primarily interested in the sort of anonymous pilots, if you like, and aircrew, I'm going to kick off with one of the more famous ones, Group Captain Peter Townsend. And the reason that I decided to do this is because Peter's story has suddenly gained a little bit of currency because of the very popular Netflix series, The Crown, which of course tells us in these episodes about the romance between Peter and Princess Margaret that ended in tears, really, because Peter was a divorcee, and because of the situation with society, the Church of England at the time, Margaret was unable to marry Peter. And it's interesting to see how this man is portrayed in that series. And I think that the chap who plays him gets him quite right, for those who've seen it, except that Peter was extremely good looking and so sophisticated. He was almost elegant, I always thought, but he was a fabulous person. a real role model, I always thought. And he wrote me hundreds of letters over the years between jumping on aircraft at different airports. He'd sit and write me a letter. It's absolutely fantastic to think that somebody like that spent the time to do that. And Peter was a pre-war RAF officer and pilot. He was Cranwell. And in the early part of 1940, where he's pictured here, serving on 43 Squadron at Wick in Scotland with his two ground members, ground crew people, Duxbury and Hacking. They were up there in the north of England, and strangely enough, on the 3rd of February 1940, it was Peter's Blue Section of Hurricanes that destroyed this Heinkel 111 of KG-26 that crashed near Whitby. And this is the first German aircraft to crash on English soil since 1918. But the really interesting thing about it is Peter shot and badly wounded the rear gunner, Carl Missy, who he went to see in hospital. And this is where we start to get into the real Peter Townsend, because this deeply moved him, as he wrote in his own autobiography.
Dilip, sorry, you haven't shared your screen. We're not seeing the pictures.
Should have done.
No, the pictures are going out. There we are. Yeah, we got them now. Thank you.
Right, okay. Right, we'll just go back and talk about Peter Townsend. So Peter, you know, this extraordinary man who wrote me all these letters, there's some of them there, up at Wick with 43 Squadron, early 1940. 3rd of February, they destroy the Heinkel, the first one to crash on English soil since 1918. And then he goes to see Carl Missy, the rear gunner, in hospital, who'd lost a limb, and it deeply moved him. And this is the humanitarian side of Peter Townsend. And I think that defines Peter Townsend much more than what he's actually remembered for. During the Battle of Britain, of course, Peter was the commander of 85 Squadron, decorated, an ace, seen here, leading 85 Squadron. They were based then at Debden and Croydon throughout the battle. And after the Battle of Britain and his night fighter exploits, he became equerry to King George VI, and hence all of the Princess Margaret business. But after that, and Peter left the Air Force after all the scandal, he became a war reporter and a writer, and he wrote his own books, his excellent history of the Battle of Britain, Jewel of Eagles, and Time and Chance, his autobiography, and became a war reporter. And he visited the scene of the fighting from the Arab-Israeli wars in the 60s in the Golan Heights, and was again deeply moved to see dead bodies, because although he'd shot people down in aerial combat, this is the first time he'd actually seen the effect of hostile fire. And when I got to know Peter, he just auctioned his medals for about 100,000 and used that money to set up a trust fund for child victims of war. And in fact, I think when I met him, he was 70, and he was just returned from a trip to the South China Sea, rescuing boat people. And that's something that never really comes out about Peter Townsend. All you hear about is Princess Margaret, Princess Margaret. But Peter was a real humanitarian. And sadly, he died very happily married in France to Marie Luce in 1995. And he's pictured there on the right with another Battle of Britain ace, Ginger Lacey, when they were both technical advisors for the Battle of Britain film. So there's just a little bit about Peter Townsend that might resonate with some, having watched The Crown. Now, this chap, it really personifies the people I was particularly interested in. This is Peter Fox, who was a 19-year-old Hurricane pilot in the Battle of Britain with 56 Squadron. So Peter's posted to 56 at Boscombe Down. This is actually from the album of Peter Down, 56 Squadron, previously been at North Weald during the Battle of Britain and pulled out to 10 Group down to Boscombe Down there. And on the 30th of September 1940, Peter is on his first sortie, and this big raid comes in. This is the real end of the daylight bomber offensive by KG-55 Heinkel bombers, escorted by Messerschmitt 110s, which is what that is, and ME-109s coming in to attack the aircraft factories at this time, and they're coming to get the aircraft factory Westerns at Yeovil. Unfortunately, the target was obscured by cloud, and they ended up bombing Sherborne, the little town next door, by mistake, with substantial loss of life. But Peter is shot down, and remarkably, he bails out. Now, this picture is from a series from the album of Lawrence Thorogood, 87 Squadron, of bailing out. And it's just nonsense, because you wouldn't bail out like this. I mean, you'd invert the aircraft, take the pin and drop out, which is what Peter did. But he managed to bail out near Lyme Regis. And years later, we were able to take Peter back in, I think it was 1993, to meet eyewitnesses and the landowner. And we excavated the crash site. And Peter was one of the most enthusiastic people you could ever meet. And he was straight in there with a spade, recovering bits and pieces of his old aircraft. But the great thing about it was, to recover these aircraft, you have to have a license from the Ministry of Defence. And we made Peter a member of our team and put the license application in Peter's name. Now, when you've recovered these aircraft, you then have to fill in a returns form so that the right of ownership is transferred from the Crown to the license holder. So consequently, Peter came to own his own Battle of Britain Hurricane, even if it was in a million pieces. And to the best of my knowledge, he's the only one of the few to ever own his own Battle of Britain aircraft. And we were delighted to present these items to him, which I think was at one of my book launches back in 1995. And Peter left us 10 years later. Now, Peter trained with Ken Wilkinson, who in more recent years, until Ken died, was a great ambassador for the few, and Dennis Nick Nichols. They were very much the sort of three musketeers. And Nick was another correspondent, and had a similar sort of experience to Peter, really, because on the 7th of October, and these lads are volunteer reservists, they've learned to fly at the weekends and in the evening, and then they're mobilised when war breaks out, you know, and they're on the squadrons. These are not professional airmen, these are not Cranwellians. So we need to understand how the RAF was comprised at this time, with auxiliaries, reservists and professional airmen. And Nick is also, like Peter, posted to 56 Squadron. And a week after Peter, on the 7th of October 1940, the Germans come back, KG-51s, Junkers 88s, again escorted by ME-110s and 109s, to attack Yeovil again. And Nick is shot down on this occasion, and he bails out. And here's our poor chap now in this sequence of photographs, having quite a hard time, I think, getting off the wing of this Hurricane. But Nick bails out, and he floats down and lands at a place called Alton Pancras in Dorset, where his Hurricane crashed. And in that same year, 93, we took Nick back. That's Nick on the left, with Peter Wolf, Hans Wolf, who was a German pilot. Peter had flown Heinkels in Russia, and then he flew Me-410s and Focke-Wulf 190s against the American daylight bomber offensive, until he was shot down and captured on New Year's Day 45, Operation Bodenplatte. Like a lot of prisoners, married an English girl, stayed here. Absolutely brilliant company was Peter, and they were all great friends, all of these people. The fact that Peter had been on the other side made no difference. So Peter was with us when we did a little excavation down at Alton Pancras. There wasn't a great deal found. Again, it was real fragmentary, in fact, but it was great to present Nick with some of those bits and pieces too. Now, this is somebody who ended up being quite a well-known pilot, and if anybody was anonymous back in the day, it was William Walker, who became, I think, one of the great sweeties, if you like, of the Battle of Britain. Such a charming gentleman. There's William on the left there with his cap on, with Ian Hutchinson, who was another Spitfire pilot, Treble 2 Squadron in the battle. And it's an interesting story because William was a VR officer, and he trains on Harvard, which is what they did. They ab initio on Tiger Moths, then Harvards, then to progress to the Spitfire and Hurricane. And that's William in the front cockpit there, taken from the cockpit of Robert Thorogood's Harvard when they were both training together. The only problem being, well, actually, it depends which way you look at it. That's the result of William's first night landing at Brize Norton, and they all thought he was dead. So they were mighty surprised when Lucky Walker, as he was known, came walking into the mess covered in blood and so on and so forth. So that was a bit of a mishap, but he survived that to be posted to 616 Squadron at Leconfield. And this is an auxiliary squadron. So the auxiliaries at that time, it's still a socially elite setup, the Auxiliary Air Force. But the identity of the Auxiliary Air Force is beginning to change because of the demand for new pilots, replacement pilots. VR pilots are being posted in, plus, of course, pilots from the occupied lands, which we'll come on to shortly. So William's up there at Leconfield, very keen to get stuck in. And on the 19th of August, 616 is sent south to Kenley, which the previous day had been badly battered in the hardest day, as my great friend and mentor Alfred Price later famously called it. So on the left, we've got Jack Bell, Teddy St. Aubin, who was a fascinating character and formerly a guards officer of all things before becoming a pilot, and William. And these people are cock-a-hoop, they're gung-ho, they want to get down there and get some action. And they get to Kenley and find the place really, as I said, quite battered and damaged, and realise that this is a whole different ball game. So at this time, Fighter Command squadrons, most of them are still flying the Vic, where the idea is that we're going to bring 24 guns to bear instead of just the 8 of a single fighter by flying in tight formation. The problem being that the pilot has to spend far too much time concentrating on formation flying and not enough time looking around for the enemy. The Germans, on the other hand, worked all this out in Spain in the mid-1930s. So they're flying the Schwarm, which is comprised of two pairs, the rotor, leader and wingman. The leader's job to get the shot, the wingman to protect his leader's tail. And these aircraft, these are bunched together for the camera, but they actually fly line abreast, loose, 200 meters apart, stepped up, each protecting the other, no fear of collision, able to search the sky. And on the 26th of August 1940, 616 Squadron is scrambled to patrol Dover at Angels 20. William's yellow section with Teddy St. Aubin and Sergeant Marmaduke Ridley. And unfortunately, high in the sky, and the 109s were always up high, just below the stratosphere, is the whole of Jagdgeschwader 51, all three Gruppen, so that's 9 squadrons of 109s altogether, prowling around up there on a Freihunter, a free-range fighter sweep, just waiting for the RAF to respond. And of course, they can see these Spitfires climbing miles and miles beneath them, and down they come. And it's all over in a few seconds, really. So William Walker is shot down by none other than the Commodore himself, Major Werner Melders, the father of modern air fighting, as he's well known for. And William's rapidly over the side and bails out. So Melders had got all of this worked out, always attacked from the blind spot, worked it all out in Spain, remarkable fighter pilot. William bails out into the Channel. Now, this is a bubblegum card that we used to collect when we were kids, part of the promotion for the Battle of Britain film. And it says a British pilot escapes death after a dogfight. Now, I've got to tell you, folks, I was never convinced by that, even when I was 8 years old. He certainly didn't look very well to me. But fortunately, William bails out over the Goodwin Sands and ends up paddling to a bit of a shipwreck and sitting on it. And he was fortunate to get picked up and rescued by a passing trawler, which then hands him over to an RAF high-speed launch. And at the time, don't forget that airspeed rescue really was in its infancy. So William survives to fight another day. Two other German pilots made claims, Joschko Futzow and Pips Priller, and Priller got St. Aubin, who crash landed, and Futzow killed Marmaduke Ridley, who's buried in Hawking Cemetery today. So for William, he actually got a bullet in his ankle, which was eventually, cutting a long story short, removed at RAF Hospital Helton. So he survived the whole thing. And his attitude really was, when I discovered he'd been shot down by Melders, and I rang him to tell him, all very excited as a young historian, you know, his attitude was, well, old boy, if you're going to be shot down, it might as well be by the top man. So you can't argue with that. But William always kept that bullet as a keepsake and souvenir. And I don't know where it is. I think it's still in the family possession. I hope it is. And it would be nice to see it in a museum perhaps one day. But that's a 7.92mm German bullet putting William's ankle by, the father of modern air fighting himself. And what a lovely man. He was a poet. I think his book of poems is available from the Battle of Britain Memorial Trust shop, not to be missed. And of course, one of his poems, Our Wall, is on the wall. And it's great to see William remembered there, who died, I think, in 2012, aged 99. So he didn't quite make the century. And moving on to somebody else who was famous in his day, but not so much these days, surprisingly, Air Marshal Sir Dennis Crowley Milling. Now, Crow, as he was universally known, was an old Malvernian. And at the time, I lived and worked in Malvern, and Crow used to visit me quite often when he was president of the Old Scholars Association at Malvern College. But again, Crow was originally a VR pilot and ended up being posted into 242 Squadron, Canadian Squadron, which was subsequently taken over by Douglas Bader in time for the Battle of Britain, who rebuilt it into a morale high unit. The problem being they were in 12 groups, they're not in the front line, and they've really got a problem to get into action, which Bader, it was intolerable for Bader not to be absolutely at the sort of cutting edge of all this. And that's a whole different story about the big wing controversy for another day. But this is an amazing photo from Crow's album with Crow on the right, Bader sat there in the old fur-collared flying suit, and the others there clearly very bored and frustrated about the lack of action. But Crow certainly got some action, and this is his Hurricane P3715, that on the 7th of September 1940, the day the Germans bombed London for the first time, Bader leads the wing, his 3-squadron wing at that time, into action for the first time, and they're caught on the climb. Again, that couldn't be in a worse tactical position. Down come the 109s, Crow gets shot up, and his Hurricane manages to, the armoured glass windscreen that he's holding there stops around, which would otherwise have killed him. So it was a lucky escape. And he went on to fly all through the Battle of Britain and become a flight commander with 610 Squadron, flying Spitfires as part of Bader's Tangmere wing, until he was shot down himself over France in August 1941 and evaded, made a home run across the Pyrenees. And then commanded a Typhoon Squadron and a Typhoon wing, made a highly successful career at the Royal Air Force, retiring as an Air Marshal, and with Group Captain Sir Hugh Dundas there and Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson, who were all very, very close friends of Douglas Bader's for his lifetime. When Bader died in 1982, Crow was absolutely pivotal in setting up the Douglas Bader Foundation to uphold Douglas's memory as an inspiration to the disabled. Now, somebody who was really anonymous actually years ago, and then suddenly became a leading light, and another terrific ambassador for the few was Geoffrey Wellham on the right there, Squadron Leader Geoffrey Boywell. Now, Jeff surprised everybody, I think, when suddenly this memoir that he'd written is published and becomes a global bestseller. And the description of him being attacked and shot up badly by an ME-109 and getting away with it is probably 3 or 4 or 5 of the best pages you could ever read in your life. Thought it was fantastic. And when I wrote about Jeff for the final few in 2015, it was difficult because he told his story. I didn't simply want to retell it. So I sort of focused more on his friendship with Brian Kinkham, pictured here, I also knew, and the programme that Matthew Whiteman made, the docudrama First Light, based on his book. But when I went and took Jeff out for lunch and went back to the bungalow, I was absolutely amazed to discover that he was a ship modeller. And he was brilliant at it. I mean, Jeff lived down at Cornwall and he'd been a harbour master. He loved ships. But these models were absolutely fantastic. So I love that photograph of Jeff. And it's, you know, a really good one of Jeff at home. So the poles, let's talk about the poles. We hear a great deal about the poles today. It used to be an untold story. I don't think it is now. I think that the awareness has been raised, and rightly so, and we're in a different place. Back in the 1980s, it was very different. Poland was still behind the Iron Curtain, and information was difficult to come by. The Polish and Sikorsky Institute in London was always very helpful, but the Polish community here, particularly the wartime survivors, tended to keep quite a low profile because of the situation with Stalin and still having families over there in Poland, in the Soviet bloc. So it was a very different scenario. But one of the people I found was Wing Commander, or Squadron Leader, sorry, Jurek Poplowski in Buenos Aires. And he was a really fascinating individual. The stories that these people could tell, who were Polish Air Force pre-war and evacuated, was absolutely fantastic. What they went through was extraordinary. Their commitment to the fight and free in Poland was remarkable. And this is Jurek after the Battle of Britain. He flew with 111 and 229 squadrons in the battle as a replacement pilot up towards the end, then moves on to 308 Squadron, all Polish squadron at Backington near Coventry, where they're converting from Hurricanes to Spitfires, and flies #1 Polish fighter wing down at Norfolk, all through the non-stop offensive of 1941, way beyond that. That's him in the centre with General Sosnowski at Ballyherbert in 1943, by which time he was commanding 315 Squadron, and went right the way through the war as one of these sort of anonymous unsung heroes that Peter Fox, in fact, always described himself and his friends as also Rams. And I really think that's a brilliant way of looking at it, that to me, they're all extraordinary. But to them, they were just also Rams, and Jurek would certainly agree with that. And he married Maria and was very happy over in Buenos Aires, where he emigrated after the war. And it's great to still be friendly with the family today. I mean, Jurek left us again 2004. So there's a common theme here that none of the people I'm talking about are obviously alive now, because the Fighter Association's only got a membership of 1, which is very sad. So one of my very early correspondents, somebody else probably people have never heard of these days, Wing Commander Roger Baldy, who was a bit of a character, was Roger. And Roger was from Grays in Essex, took a short service commission before the war, learned to fly at Sywell, became a pilot, posted to 142 Squadron, flying fairy battles, and went out to France when it all started. Now, he didn't actually take part in any operations in France. The 142 Squadron were actually the first RAF unit to attack the Germans on the 10th of May 1940 when they invaded the West. But Roger flew back to England on the 22nd of May in a Tiger Moth, landing at Hawkinge, but then returned to 198 Squadron, then 142 Squadron, and was involved in dive bombing German invasion barges in Boulogne and Calais and along the coast there, before later in August answering fighter commands call for volunteers. So he converts to Spitfires, and he's then posted to Sailor Milan's 74 Tiger Squadron. Now, I've just finished a very detailed biography of Sailor Milan, and I think the great thing about Milan, and I'm not going to talk in detail about this, but it was not only his role as a wartime fighter pilot and leader, but his work as a freedom fighter in South Africa after the war, fighting against apartheid, and that's a whole new story. But for Roger Baldy, being part of Milan's Tiger Squadron was an incredible experience, because there he was able to mix with some very serious and experienced fighter pilots like John Freeborn there, Henrik Skesny, the Pole, and Harborne Mackay Stevens. These are very experienced people. And on the 11th of May 1941 was the last massive night raid on London as the Blitz came to a close before Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June when Hitler invaded Russia. And on that night, so desperate is the hour, we've got what are called fighter nights with Spitfires and Hurricanes pressed into night flying, flying up over London, entering the searchlight area through a gate in the searchlight and prowling around hoping to see a German bomber. It rarely worked, but on that night, Roger found one purely by chance and was, more surprised than anybody else, and had a low-level chase with this aircraft across Kent and shot it down, and it crashed at Ashford, where the pilots went and visited it and took lots of photographs the following day. So that was a remarkable thing. After that, 74 Squadron are at Manston and Gravesend, and they're taking part in the non-stop offensive. Roger flew as Sailor Milan's number 2 on a number of occasions until the 17th of June 1941, when suddenly he gets a big bang in the back of the cockpit. It all goes wrong and he bails out and he's captured, and the German did actually capture him and say, "For you, the war is over," which Roger did think was very funny. So Roger's then a prisoner for the rest of the war. After the war, he took a permanent commission and had a remarkable career, commanded 33 Squadron flying Lancasters and then 249 Squadron flying Vampires here in the Middle East. And he was station commander at Coningsby, left the RAF, really quite anonymous. We were in touch in the 1980s, and Roger was a great friend and supporter, attended lots of events, seen on the left there with Kajek Buzik, who was a Polish Spitfire pilot from just after the Battle of Britain until the end of the war, and died quite early on, really, like 1993. So it's been really amazing to meet people like that, and to record their memories, which are now long gone. Fortunately, we've still got Roger's logbook and his medals and his Caterpillar Club card and things like that are in the possession of the family. So we've got access to that material. And my prized possession is his invitation and brochure from the premiere night of the Battle of Britain film, which for me, that imagery of the swastika flag and the Union Jack there, or the Union flag, I should call it, is absolutely iconic. So it fascinated me when I was 7 years old. So it's wonderful to have that. So, and it's also great to be able to give these stories currency again. Very quickly with this one, we're going to have to go to a bit of a gallop now. 19 Squadron's always been my big thing, based at Duxford and Falmere, led by Squadron Leader Brian Lane for most of the Battle of Britain. And I knew all of the survivors, in fact. But when my first book came out in 1990, which was about 19 Squadron in the Battle of Britain, this photograph was in it. Now, this is one of the most famous photographs, arguably, taken during the Battle of Britain, 21st of September 1940, by Stanley Devon, the official Air Ministry photographer at Falmere. But it was always anonymously captioned. So we know now that in the cockpit is Sergeant Bernard Jennings, Jimmy Jennings, but nobody ever knew who the armourer was until the book came out, and I got a letter from him. Because it was about 19 Squadron, a member of the family had bought Fred Roberts the book, and he wrote to me to tell me that that was he. And that was it. The other extraordinary thing was I was living in Worcester at the time, and Fred had lived in Worcester for years and worked on the railway, although he just retired and moved to South Wales. So Fred was another great friend and supporter, as was Jimmy. And it's Fred on the left and Jimmy on the right. Jimmy survived the war, DFM, awarded an AFC after the war, stayed in the RAF, retired as a wing commander, and we were able to reunite them in 1992, which was a splendid thing to do. And Jimmy's daughter gave me his Battle of Britain Fighter Association tie. I've collected quite a few of these over the years and have them framed up, and they're just such a massive inspiration to look above my desk when I'm writing and see these things. So yeah, Fred and Jimmy, and as far as I know, that's the only example of that photograph that they ever signed. So it's a wonderful thing to have in the archive. And the final story that I'm going to talk about is somebody else who was so totally anonymous and very, very happy with that. And the most modest man you could ever meet, to the extent that he drove his family to utter distraction, was John Francis Durham Elkington, better known as Tim or the Elk. And this is Tim. Tim was Cranwell very early on and very young, and was posted after Cranwell to number 1 squadron. This is Tim, the tallest, wearing the Irving flying jacket, and stood next to him in the life jacket is another old friend, Pat Hancock, who for many years was the honorary secretary of the Battle of Britain Fighter Association, and very kindly used to forward my letters to the few and invite me to the annual reunions at Bentley Priory, which was an extraordinary experience. And when Tim walked in, their attitude was, oh my God, they're sending us schoolboys now. Because he just looked, well, he was so young. He was 20, I think, at the time, if that. So Tim is part of this at Northolt now, this squadron. And they're in action on the 15th of August, Eagle Day, Adlertag. And Tim damages a Messerschmitt 109, or in his words, I certainly frightened it. And the following day, there's another big raid, and Tim is shot down by this character, Major Helmut Wick of JG2, one of the leading German aces at the time, like Melders. And Tim takes to his parachute. The only problem is he's unconscious because he's been wounded and he's drifting out to sea. So Fred Berry on the right there uses the prop wash off his Hurricane to blow him back in towards the land, and fortunately it worked, and Tim floated down and landed on the beach at East Wittering. His mother actually lived near Gosport at the time and was watching all this, and watched this parachute coming down, obviously blissfully unaware that her son was dangling beneath it wounded. Unfortunately, Tim never got the opportunity to thank Berry, who's pictured at his wedding day there, because Fred Berry was killed in action on the 1st of September 1940 before Tim returned to the squadron, and that was always a big regret for Tim. After the Battle of Britain, Tim went on the RAF expedition to Russia, flying Hurricanes over there, teaching the Russians how to fly Hurricanes and to give them some air support. So that was quite an adventure. Then the Merchant Ship Fighter Unit, and these are Hurricanes that are rocket-assisted takeoffs of these catapult merchant ships. And once they've gone up there to try and get these long-range German reconnaissance aircraft, these 4-engine Focke-Wulf Condors, the pilot can't land again. So there's only one option, and that's to bail out into the freezing cold Arctic Sea, the North Atlantic, whatever. And, you know, wow, extraordinary. Tim, fortunately, didn't make catapult launch, but they were there and they would have done if they had to. And this photo was another amazing thing. I'd had the photo for years. It was taken by Tim's flight commander, who was latterly Air Vice Marshal Michael Lyne, who missed the Battle of Britain on account of being wounded during the Dunkirk fighting with 19 Squadron. But Michael gave me a few of these photos, and it was only fairly recently that I showed Tim this, and it's Tim Elkington flying the Hurricane, formating on Michael. So that was an amazing thing. And that's actually a Merchant Ship Fighter Unit Hurricane when they were training. They're obviously not about to bail out into the sea. But more recent years, Tim flew in a Spitfire again, and during the rest of the war, he served in India, survived a lot of crashes, things like that, had a extraordinary career in the post-war RAF flying Shackletons, and he was an observer at the Bikini atom bomb trials, things like that. But to talk to Tim, no, look, he said, I was just pilot officer idiot. I didn't know what was going on. I really didn't. And when we did a few, the final few, trying to do Tim's chapter was so difficult because he was just so modest, and he just didn't even want his combat reports published that have been in the public domain since the 1970s. One of the nicest people you could ever hope to meet, and a lovely, lovely family to boot. And many hours spent with Tim chatting about those days. And one day he said to me, when I was over there for Sunday dinner, the last time I saw him actually, August 9, 2018, I was talking about Beachy Head because I'd just come back from staying in a lighthouse down there, and he said, you know, he said one day we were flying over Beachy, and I had the cockpit hood open. We were quite low, and the farmers were burning stubble in the field, and I could smell this wood smoke, and I thought, that's England, that is, and that's worth fighting for. And it was such a brilliant quote. And I just put it on Facebook, you know, just come back from lovely afternoon with Tim Elkington, you know, this is what he said. Oh, Tim wasn't happy about that. Oh, dear boy, why did you have to put that there? You know, it makes me sound like I'm shooting a line. God forbid you'd be seen to be shooting a line. But it was a fantastic quote, it really was. And it summed it up, I think, that it was England and it was worth fighting for. Tim died February 2019, and I was privileged to speak at his memorial service at Little Rissington Church, where there were a lot of aircrew buried, actually, because of the Central Flying School being based just down the road. And Tim was the last of the few I knew personally, and so many of them. And it was difficult to choose those I was going to include in this little show. And it's never the same twice, because I can keep varying the content so that we can keep sharing the stories. Now, the two books arising from this, the final few, which came out in 2015, I think that's still available in paperback, and Letters from the Few, which has just been published by Pen and Sword. They're available in the Battlebrick Memorial Trust Museum shop and available online, signed copies. And Pen and Sword have been very good. They've given the Trust a very generous discount so that we could all try and support the Trust in some way during this very difficult pandemic time. And that's what's important, isn't it? It's about maintaining the currency of these stories, getting them out there, raising awareness of the memorial and the wonderful work that revolves around it, and trying to make absolutely sure that this is going to continue and that we are going to keep the stories of the few current. We're going to keep the currency. We're absolutely not going to let this go. And that is really, as Forrest Gump said in the famous film, all I have to say about that. It is a passion of mine, and I hope that you've been entertained for the last few minutes and seen some interesting photographs, and that we're all going to carry on supporting the Trust as much as we can.
Well, thanks very much, Dilip. An absolutely fascinating talk. It's interesting that I actually knew quite a few of those few as well, and I have to say they are absolutely people that you never forget. They are absolutely beautiful people, and they are worth remembering as well. To our audience, we've got some questions come in. If anybody wants to ask a question of Dilip, then use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just type it in, and we'll try and get in as many as we can. The question session will be about 10 minutes long. So let's kick off with some of the ones that we've got in already, Dilip.
Okay.
We've got in one from, which I'm just trying, it's Israel, I think it is. Anyway, it says, we're all aware of mental health and PTSD in these modern days. What would say it was for the few from their extreme experiences of the summer of 1940 and beyond in World War II? I think their mentally they were quite tough, but I'll let you answer that one.
It's difficult to say, really, and I'm no expert in it, but certainly people like Dennis Robinson from 152 Squadron wrote very much about survivor guilt, and I think a lot of them did feel like that. William Walker said, you know, they were the most exciting times, but one lost so many friends, and it was the hams like me that survived, where the more skilled pilots seemed to get killed. And it was just luck in some ways. And I think survivor guilt, certainly. But yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, I think possibly that recording their memories in their retirement, when and it was all about timing, when I came on the scene, they just retired. And probably for the first time, they got time to sit and think about these things. You know, I think it helped possibly get it out of the system, you know.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We've got another one, more of a comment really from Paul Knott. I'm an aircraft weapons engineer working for a company in Ascot. Just thought I'd mention Johnny Johnson and Douglas Bader were associate directors back in the 70s and 80s. They were good friends. So that was nice that somebody else knows about them as well.
Good.
Rick Peacock Edwards sent one in. Nice to hear from you, Rick. I hope your tours will get back on soon. Rick says he flew Lightnings on 92 Squadron in Germany, and his father was a Battle of Britain pilot. Would love to see you write a book about 92 Squadron. 19 Squadron was our sister squadron at Gütersloh, so I know it might be difficult to show an allegiance to both. There's one for you, did it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've written about 92 Squadron a fair bit Jeff's chapter in the final few, and with the Milan book, because of course 92 was part of Milan's Biggin Hill wing. But yeah, well, never say never.
All right. A few more. Oh, right. Here's one for you. What's been the hardest book you wrote and why?
Well,
out of the many that you've done.
Well, actually, not a Battle of Britain book. The hardest one was Arnhem 1944, the human tragedy, the bridge too far. That's about 130,000 words and tells the story of Market Garden through casualty stories, which, you know, is what really does motivate and move me. And that is a very complicated operation, and it was a very, very complicated book to write. So without a doubt, that one, yeah.
Question from David Bickers. I think I know the answer, but you'll probably tell us better.
Yeah.
Did you ever meet Bob Stanford Tuck?
Yeah, I did, and I corresponded with him. David Bickers is Douglas Bader's son-in-law, by the way. Hi, David. Been a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did correspond very briefly, but he died very shortly afterwards. That was nothing to do with me, I hasten to add. Although they did used to actually joke that if you had a letter from me, you probably weren't going to be around much longer. But Bob Stanford Tuck, I didn't know well, but I sort of, you know, we all know about Stanford Tuck, don't we? And yeah, I had a couple of letters from him back in the day. I'll have to dig them out, actually. I can't remember what they were about now. I know Reg Nutter, who flew with him, wrote to me quite extensively and thought very highly of Tuck. It's quite an interesting account that he wrote me.
Yeah. Yeah, I met him a couple of times when I was up at Biggin. Yeah. Right. Here's one for you. Another one. This is from Deborah, who is one of our trustees. So hi, Deb. You obviously got to meet a lot of the veterans, but of those you didn't meet, who would you have liked to have met and spent time with?
Well, if we were to talk about casualties, you know, Brian Lane has always been somebody who's massively inspired me, and Brian Lane is somebody I'd like to sit down and have a long chat with, you know, very much so. But in terms of survivors, well, it's difficult to say because I probably met or spoke to most of them over the years. You know, it's difficult to say really. I'd have to think about that one.
Yeah. Here's one from Peter. It says, were the aircraft developed during the war to improve pilot protection?
Well, yes, they were, because the Spitfire and the Hurricanes, they started off without armor-plated glass windscreens, and of course we've seen Dennis Crowley Milling with his shattered armor-plated glass windscreen there. So they had the glass armor. Then there was the fuel, you know, the armor plate behind the fuel tank and in front of the instrument panel, the armor plate behind the pilot's back, behind his head, and so on. So they did become more armored, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think as the engine power developed, they could put more onto it, couldn't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, another one from Flynn. Flynn had a relative fighting in the Battle of Britain, John Arthur Peter McClintock of 615 Squadron. He shot down a 109 of JG52 with the nose art depicting a red devil, which went on.
I remember the one.
Which went on to be showed around lots of different cities in Britain. where people could pay whatever they wanted to scratch, and then the money went to the Spitfire fund. He's asking, was that a common procedure?
Okay, well, yes and no, because what we're talking about here is Lord Beaverbrook's Spitfire Fund, which was an absolute masterstroke, genius propaganda, where Beaverbrook appealed for pots and pans to make Spitfires, and for people to collect money to give to the government, the Air Ministry, to buy a Spitfire. £5,000 was put as the nominal sum for this, that excluded the armament, the engine. It was masterful because it gave the home front an opportunity to do something to hit back at the German bombers. The reality was that pots and pans were too low grade aluminium. You can't make aircraft out of those, but it engaged people. It was fantastic. But the Spitfire Fund, it wasn't about scratching names in aircraft. I mean, these aircraft, if you, for example, Worcester, my own city, bought two, P8045 and 46, City of Worcester 1 and 2. And the names of these aircraft were painted in yellow on the nose, on the fuselage, just forward of the cockpit. So yes, it was. And there were a lot of them as well, these presentation aircraft. So that's that one then. Yeah.
Yeah. One here from an anonymous, but nonetheless welcome visitor to the webinar. When the guys visited the airfields they flew in later years, what emotions did it evoke in them, and how did they feel about the airfields being torn down?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I know that, you know, they have been very upset over the years about a lot of the building that's gone on these different sites. And I remember that there was a bit of a campaign back in the late 80s about North Weald, I think it was, that you know, a number were very fired up about, understandably so. But I think that to answer that question, the greatest quote for me was from Brian Kinkham, when he said that when I go back to my old station, and he was talking about Biggin Hill, I walk with ghosts.
Yeah, having spent a lot of time at Biggin Hill, that was a common feeling, I think.
So I mean, it's strange, isn't it? Because some of these places are lost, some of them, you know, are still there. I mean, I went to Duxford a lot with people like Jimmy Jennings and George Unwin, who were in 19 Squadron, flying from Duxford and Falmere. I think it was slightly different for them because the place was vibrant, buzzing with people, and a you know, at the cutting edge of keeping it all current and so on and so forth. You know, I don't know, but that quote of Brian Kinkham's really resonates with me. I thought that was an extraordinary thing to say. Wonderful.
Got another question from John Bushby. Do you think there's an increase in interest in the period?
That's a strange one, really, because on the one hand, we've got a generation of people missing from this now. The wartime generation have virtually passed, so we've lost all those people. They have perhaps been replaced by new generations who are interested in it. And I think that in the last probably 20 years, certainly since the advent of the internet, there's been this burgeoning interest in genealogy, and people, you know, are researching family backgrounds, and they're becoming increasingly proud of having people who were involved with the Second World War and so on and so forth. And in terms of the Second World War, surely, you know, in terms of British involvement, the Battle of Britain, you know, is the pivotal moment, isn't it? So I think I don't know whether there's more, but there's certainly a lot of interest, and it's a new wave of interest. I think possibly the right way of looking at it, and long may that be the case.
We've got time for just a couple more. Back to your books again. What was the easiest one to write, and what's your favourite book that you've written?
Oh dear.
You've written too many, Dilip.
Yeah, I mean, too many. None of them are easy. I don't think they're easy. I think photographic books can be easy-ish, but they require a lot of fact checking for captions, because you've got to get it right, you know. So the Battle of Britain photographic kaleidoscope series that I did, I don't know, a long time ago now, for the 60th, I think, round about that time. You know, they're quite sort of easy because there's not a lot of writing involved, but in other respects, they're difficult because you've obviously got to research the material. Personal favourite book, somebody else is asking, I can see. Well, every book's a journey, every book's an adventure, I like to think about it. They really are. And you make so many friends along the way and meet so many new people, particularly when you're researching casualty stories. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next webinar, 24th of February, casualties, you know. But my favourite book would have to be Spitfire, the story of a unique Battle of Britain fighter squadron, I think they called it, which is a paving slab of a book, which covers just about every aspect of society and the Air Force and a squadron life and the exploits of 19 Squadron between the outbreak of war and Brian Lane being posted away and him losing his life in 1941. Because that was my first book, was that subject. And there's no comparison between the first effort, which I wrote when I was in my 20s, without any training or anything, and to the more recently produced book, which is probably, I don't know, 120, 30,000 words and 100 photographs, I expect, if not more. So that would probably be my favourite one. Yeah, thank you.
And we're rapidly running out of time, so to take this last one, which was in the First Light documentary, I had the feeling that the relationship between Brian Kinkham and Geoffrey Wellham was a bit awkward. In the talk, you mentioned that they were good friends. So, what was it just the documentary making a dramatic point?
Oh yes, I mean they were great friends, and you know Jeff was in awe of Brian Kinkham. I think the First Light docudrama was very good, but I don't think they got Brian Kinkham quite right. He came across as too aloof and snobbish, really, and a bit arrogant. And Brian Kinkham wasn't like that. So I don't think they got that right. So should we just skim through, Andy, try and answer some more before we got to...
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah. What can we do
sorry.
To keep the stories of the few in the minds of the younger generations? Get out there to schools, talk to the schools, encourage schools to visit the National Memorial or other aviation museums, all kinds of things we can do. So look, somebody else here, Battle of Britain Fighter Association reunion dinners. Christopher Foxy Norris saying they were ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. Absolutely. They you know, I think that's right. I think it was, they considered themselves ordinary people who were plunged into extraordinary circumstances. To us, they are extraordinary people. And I absolutely agree with what Dave says there. They were extraordinary people. They were extraordinary times, extraordinary people. And without the war and without all of that happening, they'd never have experienced those things and discovered the depths of courage and ability that they had. Quite remarkable.
One last one I'll pick up on. I've just seen it here. Where they were talking about Brian Kinkham wrote that the Battle of Britain was the best time of his life, and others, Roger Hall, for instance, in Clouds of Fear, were very much troubled by their experiences. You've talked to many of the aircrew. What do you think causes the huge differences in how they felt about the battle?
Well, I think that's just people, isn't it? People are different, you know. And I mean, Geoffrey Wellham, without a doubt, suffered from PTSD, and his way of dealing with that was to promote the battle and promote the few and promote the memory of those that didn't come back. That was very much what Jeff was about, I think. And yes, Roger Hall in Clouds of Fear. I mean, I knew Roger, and yeah, I mean, he was a very troubled man, wasn't he? But I think it's all about the individual, isn't it? And people deal with things in different ways. I mean, I can relate to that from my police service, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think at that point we're going to have to draw it to a close, unfortunately. An absolutely fascinating talk, Dilip, as I fully expected it would be.
Thank you.
We've had a really big audience on it, and hopefully that audience will have been inspired to learn a bit more about the battle. You're doing another talk for us, letters from the few, I believe.
No, the next one is
it's a casualty one. Sorry, I got it
yes,
wrong.
casualties, 24th of February, 3
24th.
p.m.
Yeah.
And if anybody hasn't had a question answered, or if there are any more questions, by all means, just drop me a line through my website. You just Google me and it'll come up.
Yeah. So for that talk, look out on social media and on our website, the Battle of Britain Memorial website, and you'll get all the booking instructions for that. In the meantime, the books are available from the shop at Capel. Unfortunately, you have to buy them through the e-shop at the moment because, for obvious reasons, the shop is physically closed. But we have just 20 copies of each of them, so it'll be a first come, first serve basis. As Dilip said, we had a very generous price from Pen and Sword, so you're actually going to donate through that if you want it. But as I say, there's only 20 there, so if you go to the Battle of Britain Memorial website and go to the shop, they're there to be bought. So once again, Dilip, thank you ever so much. You're a great supporter of us.
Always a pleasure.
We'll be pleased to see you back down at Capel sometime in the future for real. But until that time, we're very grateful for you doing these webinars. So until the 24th of February, everyone, thank you for watching us, and do support us. We do need the money. We are a charity, and despite being closed, we still have to pay money out. So thanks once again, and look forward to seeing you on the 24th of February.